Thank you all. It's a delight to be with you. The town in which I grew up, Grove City, Ohio, is sort of a cultural right, blue-collar town. And when I was in elementary school, the United Methodist Church left its early 20th century building that looked like a small-town United Methodist Church and built this very exotic-looking, for those days, A-frame building with purple doors. Purple doors didn't fit the community, but they distinguished this congregation in certain ways. And after my Baptist resignation, after my Baptist ordination was recognized by the Western Pennsylvania United Methodist Conference, my pastor asked me to preach a sermon. And I talked about the church with purple doors and my experiences with it long before I formally identified with United Methodist Christians. It's reported that Albert Einstein had a poster on the wall of his office at Princeton. Not everything that can be counted counts, is what it said. This is a data-oriented presentation, so I'm going to sail through a lot of data from a lot of sources. But I want to use those data to tell a story about the context from which candidates are coming to ministry, the current students that are enrolled in the Association of Theological Schools, which comprises about 273 institutions in the United States and Canada. They are evangelical Protestant, mainline Protestant, Roman Catholic, Orthodox. So about as broad as you can stretch the Christian envelope, that's the constituency of the organization with which I work. And I want to look some at the vocational inclination and persistence of those students. And finally, if we have time, to look at expectations the graduates will encounter as they move into ministry. So let's talk about the cultural context as we begin. And by the way, this is the United Methodist Church in Grove City, Ohio, that if you enter it will have purple doors to greet you. And the purple doors have stayed since the late 1950s. And in fact, their preschool program is the Purple Door Preschool. So they have made them their congregational logo. The sheets that you have at your table simply identify the points that I'm going to be making, and the rhythm of this presentation moves from point to data, point to data, point to data. And the first thing I want to talk about in terms of cultural context, it comes from some data from the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. I think this is one of the more interesting ways to look at the social location of religion. I have a laser pointer that doesn't work, so I'll use the cursor device, which doesn't show up apparently. So I assume you all are data literate and you can find the numbers readily. The Pew has done this first really worldwide study in which it looked at religious importance as perceived by constituents in various countries and then related that to the gross domestic product in those countries. And you can see what happens. Thanks, Chris. I don't know how to point to two screens simultaneously, so I'm going to use this screen since you can see that as you might perceive from how world Christianity is changing, the greatest expressed religious commitment, this is not Christian commitment, this is pan-religion, so it could be Muslim, it could be Christian, whatever, but the greatest expressed religious commitment is also associated with the lowest gross per capita gross domestic product. And that continues. The wealthier nations become, the less expressed religious commitment in terms of do you pray, do you attend religious services, the sort of generic pan-religious questions that can be asked. And you get to Western Europe and Canada, but look where the US sits on this. The US has the highest per capita gross domestic product, but it looks like religious commitment more associated with Mexico. The US is standing alone in terms of the population's expressed religious commitment. We are in a very fundamentally shifting time of religious commitment in this culture, but it's important to understand how unique the US is in terms of liberal democracies. It's higher than in most, but religion is changing. These are long-term Gallup data, and compare the beginning in the 73s, the US population confidence in these social institutions, military, the church. If you want to feel better at the church, you can look at the Congress, which is continuing its limbo-like movement in US public opinion. And I'm sure if we were to get 13 and 14 data, this downward trend would continue. And we will see just how low a social institution can go. Religion is not perceived as receiving the confidence that it once did as a social institution. And the United States has been experiencing a declining percentage of Protestant affiliation. So in 72, this is from the General Social Survey, 62% of the US population identified as Protestant, and by 2010, that had fallen to 51%. That is a fairly significant change. You'll notice Roman Catholic has remained the same, and those who identify with no religious preference have been increasing. And if you look at the last 5 years, as it's been, these are data aggregated by the Pew Center for People in the Press, that 53% in 2007 has become about 48% in summer of 2012. This is the first time that the US population has not identified as majority Protestant. It's the first time in US history, as long as data are trackable, that the majority of the population, that doesn't mean that they loved Jesus or went to church, they just identified at least as Protestant. But and the other thing I want you to notice is where all of the loss has been. African American Protestants, Hispanic and Asian Protestants have had a slight increase over these last 5 years in the percentage of persons who express a Protestant commitment. All of the loss has been with white Protestants, both evangelical and mainline. These data from Gallup, I think, are interesting. This is a tracking of the percentage saying that religion is very important in their lives by generation. So this is the generation born before 1928. And so here's what they thought in the 70s, here's what they thought in the 80s, late 80s, 90s, late 90s. I don't know what happened to their religion in the early 2000s, but you'll notice a genuine upward trend across age. People say religion is more important as they get older, and that this is true for every generational cohort that Gallup has been able to track. The other thing you'll notice is that the starting point for each of these cohort groups is lower than the previous cohort group. except for the baby boomers who, these are the boomers, these are the, Gen Xers. They, when they were the same age these folks were, had a little bit more expressed religious commitment. But also notice the lines never cross. One cohort never catches up with the expressed religious commitment of the previous cohort. Translate that socially as to a picture of what's coming. We talk a lot about aged participants in Protestant congregations. Well, if they weren't there, you will see what the implications would be. So, students coming to seminary are coming out of a particular cultural stew. That cultural stew in the U.S. Values religion, but is declining in its Protestant affiliation, is declining a bi-generational cohort in terms of perceived importance, religion, and as a social institution. Religion as a whole has been on a somewhat steady decline in terms of the degree of confidence that the culture places in religious institutions as a generic social phenomenon. Well, let's look at the students who are coming to the 273 ATS member schools. What we know is that for the last decade, overall enrollment has been declining. This is the overall enrollment of all of these schools in the MDiv program, and it, like everything else, it grew on a relatively steady basis till about 04, 05, and we can run this back to 70, somewhere about the speaker there, and it would still be showing this general 1% or so increase every year. And then these are the other areas, broad categories of degree programs. But since 06, since before the Great Recession, enrollment had stabilized and begun to decline. And it has declined in the MDiv. It has continued relatively strong in the professional MA. That would be the other, an MA in youth ministry or religious education or counseling or other specialized areas of ministry. It's grown a little bit in the academic MA, a little bit in the professional, but in all of these areas, in the last decade, it has been declining. We just have the fall 2013 data at ATS, and the decline between 12 and 13 was about 1.8%. This means that in the last 10 years, the overall enrollment in ATS member schools has declined a little over 10%. That can't be a blip on the screen, not a process that continues for a full decade and as regularly and as systematically as that process is occurring. We've looked at these data in so many ways. We've tried to find the silver bullet, who's declining and who's growing. Evangelical Protestants are declining, mainline Protestants are declining, Canadians are declining, US is declining. We cannot find any one variable that predicts the group or the set of variables that predicts this decline. What we do know is that when in the context of this overall decline, that racial ethnic enrollment represents an increasing percentage of the ATS enrollment. So here is the same kind of, these colors are not quite showing up the same through the magnification process as they went in. I'll try to keep up. I'm only partially color sighted. And I especially don't see red. I grew up with a red letter Bible. I never thought Jesus said anything. So I was in high school. I thought the words of Jesus were sort of like Yahweh in Hebrew scriptures. It was just too special to say. But you will notice this. Over these basically 20 years, there are actually fewer white males in all degree programs in ATS member schools than there were 20 years ago. The percentage, the number of women has declined some, but when you look at racial ethnic men and racial ethnic women, the only thing that's holding the enrollment up is the growing presence. If you follow these bands across, there's not a statistical test for band following, but you'll notice that they get much wider in this group and this group, and for the white women and men, they actually shrink. So what's happening, while there's an overall decline, in actual numbers, the one group that is increasing in its enrollment in ATS schools are persons of African, Hispanic, and Asian descent. Native American and Indigenous Canadians still constitute a minuscule part. We don't track them. They're less than half of 1%, and it's hard. We do track them. They just don't show up. Yes? I'm sorry, I didn't hear. We group them with Asian. And of course, this puts all of those groups together at this point. Here's another way of looking at it. This is over from 77 to 12, and the enrollment of African Americans as a percentage of the total enrollment of ATS schools grew from 4% to 14%. That constitutes almost the exact same percentage of African Americans in the culture in the US. So how many should be enrolled in ATS schools? One of the benchmarks, does racial ethnic enrollment look like the parallel percentage in the culture, is one way we've been tracking that. So in terms of underrepresented constituencies, African Americans would not be underrepresented. They would be appropriately represented. The group that has been growing from 1% to about 8.5% now are persons of Asian descent, which would include the Pacific Islanders. That group is about 3% of the US population, and it's 8% of the enrollment of ATS member schools, so it's a dramatically overrepresented racial ethnic constituency. Yes? Most of these would be not visa students, because we track that separately. So if they're here studying from another country, these are people not on a student visa, but likely have a green card. They may, or some kind of a permanent citizenship capacity, rather than, or are second, third generation Asian descent US citizens. And this includes Canada, but the Canadian numbers don't contribute much to this chart, because several provinces in Canada forbid institutions from collecting racial data. They think that their idea of inclusion is that you don't pay attention to it legally, where our idea of inclusion is you track it very carefully to see same legal jurisprudence principle, but different implications. The group that is most underrepresented in ATS schools are Hispanics. They are now 6%. They are growing each year. They are 6% of the total enrollment, but they're about 17% of the US population. So they're enrolled at about 1/3 of what you would want them to be enrolled. We think there are a couple of reasons for that. One is the high percentage of Hispanic Roman Catholics, and Roman Catholics have fewer people in seminary than any other religious group in the US per 1,000 members of the religious community. And the second largest group would be Hispanic Pentecostals and others in free church traditions that don't require any seminary education. But we're looking and trying to deal carefully with this group. Well, here Meg provided for me some of the current, if the current 3 years, the past 3 years of certified UMC candidates, 62% are male, 38% are female, 77% are white. I think this is African American and this is Hispanic. Am I reading the colors right? The UMC seminaries are more diverse than the candidacy pattern of the UMC. It is still a more white denomination than the demographics in the society as a whole, and that shows up here. Right now, visa and racial ethnic constituents are about 35 or 36% of the total ATS enrollment, and white about 65% of the enrollment. So the UMC candidates are more white than the general enrollment of the ATS and than the general population in the US. You all know this, I just thought I would raise, this is the next 40 years, this is from the Census Bureau, the 200 million whites and by 2050 just barely over 200 million whites. Meanwhile, well over 200 million persons of color. We are on our way to a majority of color culture. And some of the candidates you're working with now, if they are young, will be the ones who will carry the church through these major decades when this fundamental shift of the American population is going to occur. This has particular issues for historically predominantly white denominations. It has significant issues for historically predominantly white congregations, and it has significant issues for historically predominantly white theological schools. No liberal democracy has experimented with the kind of racial plurality that will be on the table for the next 30 years. I think this is a wonderful gift of God. I also think that our history in the church of being able to deal with race and ethnicity is relatively miserable. Our justice rhetoric has been good. Our capacity to include, empower, and engage across racial ethnic lines has been relatively limited. That I won't preach much, but I will talk about that one. Since Richard and I first became acquainted with each other's work many, many, many decades ago, I've been looking at the issues of race and ethnicity and race and religion. And I don't know, I talk with our ATS schools about how do we help increase the cultural capacity of white students to deal with a fundamentally multiracial, multicultural world. The racial ethnic students in ATS schools are already biracial or bicultural, or they wouldn't be there. They couldn't make it through the US higher education system if they weren't culturally competent in variety of contexts. It's the white students who have up to this point been able to live with limited cultural competency in an increasingly plural, racially and ethnically plural world. Evangelical Protestants comprise the dominant seminary enrollment in the US. Here's the last 20 years. This is the enrollment in evangelical Protestant schools. This is the enrollment in mainline schools. This is the enrollment in Roman Catholic and Orthodox schools. United Methodists would be located, a few are up here, a significant number here, and the majority are here with mainline. These are the ecclesial family identification of the schools, and all schools enroll more enrolled persons outside of that dominant ecclesial family. So Asbury as a school would be included here, for example, though it enrolls a significant number of United Methodists. It self-identifies as an evangelical Protestant institution. But you'll see where, and I think that if you went to the typical U.S. town on the weekend of worship services, you would probably find about 2/3 of the Protestants are either in a church that self-identifies as evangelical or in a mainline church that lines up with the evangelical side of its denomination. And about 1/3 would be in congregations that would identify with mainline and not the evangelical subgroup of the denomination of an otherwise mainline denomination. The center of gravity in American Protestantism is now with evangelical Protestants, who are variously defined, who are broadly understood. But one of the things we've tracked at ATS as an old mainline Protestant club is the fact that now we have 2 evangelical Protestants enrolled we have the enrollment of evangelical Protestant schools is almost twice the enrollment of mainline Protestant schools. Theological education, like American religion, is very tribal. Everybody lives with their own group, talks to their own group, and kind of casts looks over at the people who speak the other language or go to the other kind of congregation. And we have a lot of crosstalk in the ATS world across these communities. And there needs to be crosstalk across these communities to deal with the fact that things have changed in the face of American Protestantism very significantly, and the same would be true for Canadian. We are at a current state in the enrollment of ATS schools that the majority of the enrollment is either over 50 or under 30. We thought about changing the name of our organization to the Association of Schools of Parents and Their Children. Here are the ATS. This is the over 50. And we collect data on age every other year. And look what's happened. They're now right at 22% of the total enrollment of ATS schools, from having been at about 11% in 95. And then this other group that's growing are the 30 and under, and the group that are declining, the age cohorts that are declining as a percentage of the overall enrollment in ATS schools are the 30 and 40. Part of this is the baby boomers coming through the system. So when they were in their 30s and 40s, they constituted the majority. They're getting older and grayer, and they're populating this part. I also think that we have moved from second career, and this would be interesting in your working with candidates, we're moving from career changers to a generation of career completers. It's what we think is happening. So they were in the military, or they taught school, or they were in civil service, and they completed a 25 or 30-year area of work, and in earlier mid-50s, they're coming into ministry. So this is not a group that are wandering among career possibilities, as we thought was often the case in the 90s. We think increasingly these are people who've come pretty close to completing one career, and then are trying to think about what do they do with the next big chunk of their lives. The United Methodist data, I think that anybody want to guess what this color is? It disappeared in the transfer. If this is this 26 to 30? So I think that becomes under 26. I can see this color very well. So 27% of the candidates are under 30, and and we lost this is a greater percentage than the combination of these two. Got me? This are the over 50, and they represent a larger percentage than these two groups combined. They're about 31 or 32%, I think. I'm opening it up on my. Okay, because it's showing up on this computer the same way it is there. So the candidates in the UMC world look a little bit like the current ATS enrollment. The majority are either over 50 or under 30. The difference is that in the ATS enrollment, there's a slightly higher percentage of under 30 and a lower percentage of over 50 year-old candidates. Yes?
So if you start, the under 26 starts with the 16%, and then it moves around the circle clockwise, going down the key there.
And what is the percentage for the over 50?
15, that's 31%.
Okay, 31% to 27%. So the majority of the candidates you work with are either the age of parents and their children, generationally. That's over 50% of the candidates, and we'll come back to some of these data. We've asked in a survey that is taken by a lot of students. These are MDiv students only, and I won't mention these ends again, but you can see this is a number of schools who participate in a fee-for-service program at ATS where we provide a survey for entering students, and then they can look at a number of things. But we've asked them, when did you first consider thinking about theological education or ministry? Relatively stable over time. We've taken 5 years. 27% were actually thinking about ministry before college. Another 30% thinking about it during college. So right at 60% thinking about it at a time it would influence what courses they might take. 40% didn't even begin thinking about theological education until after college, after graduate school, or after they've been working. If you want to compare these data to law or medicine or other professions that theological schools would like to, or ministry would like to think that are its cousins, they're completely different. If you're not thinking about medicine before college, it's almost already too late. So one of the things that's happened, we don't know how this has changed long-term. Our perception is that somehow the church is not signaling the vocation and ministry in ways that young people can figure it out. It comes with life experience, it comes, and many of these older folks, as I'm sure you may have experience with more intimately than I, since you talk with real people, I just talk with data. A lot of them will say, you know, I've thought about this earlier, but now is the right life space for me to pursue this, one way or the other. This is not that the first time they thought about it came, but it's something they've been carrying with them, which raises the issue, why hasn't the church helped them discern their vocation? We might have been able to get more years of service from some of these folks. Student debt is increasing significantly, and I can't help but imagine that in your candidacy conversations, debt is coming up. I'm going to look at it two ways. We ask students who graduate from seminary, and these are MDiv students only, so it's about 3,000 is the size of the ends in this. How much debt did you bring to seminary, and how much debt did you incur while you were at seminary? This is the individual's speculation of how much debt they have. It doesn't distinguish between student loans and credit card debt. So all we know is this is how they're responding to this question. About 2/3, or about 60%, just under 60%, say they didn't bring any debt with them from undergraduate schools, but 40%, only 40% or fewer, say they're leaving seminary without debt. So we now have 60% of seminary students leaving with debt that was incurred while they were in seminary. And you can see what's happening. Less than 20,000 has been hovering around 20 and is declining, and where those percentage points are being picked up is an increase in more than $40,000 of debt. We know from a current study that the people most inclined to borrow as undergraduates are the most inclined to borrow as seminary students. So you've got an additive effect of $40,000 of undergraduate debt and $30,000 or $40,000 of seminary debt, and you now have a person for whom a significant portion of a starting salary, minimum salary in the United Methodist Conference is being allocated to debt amortization. Our colleagues at the Auburn Center for the Study of Theological Education have looked more deeply into debt, and they've gone to a sample of schools and examined the financial aid profiles of students in about 100 ATS schools. So these are not what this is not data about how much debt the students think they have. This is how much data is in their financial aid transcript at the seminary. And of those who borrowed, which has increased in 1991, less than half borrowed, and of those who borrowed, they owed $11,000. In 2001, about just slightly over half borrowed, and they owed $25,000. Now, two-thirds to over 60% have borrowed, and of those who borrow, their average debt is over $38,000. This is not a sustainable system. The cost of theological education has gone up. The contributions from religious organizations has gone down. The funding of theological education has moved either to the students in terms of tuition, which translates into individually owned debt, or to individual donors who give to a school that they never attended, which is a very different kind of appeal for presidents to make than all of the appeal letters you get from your undergraduate institution that has remembered you all of these years simply because they had the hope that you might make a contribution. This is very worrisome for the life of the church. The variation, these are the means now of all of the students, including those who borrowed and didn't borrow. So this looks better than when you really look at the 60% now who did borrow and how much money they're leaving in debt. Motivations for pursuing theological education are stable over time. And I will just, you can see, these are entering students, these are ends of 3,000 to 4,000, different group every year. I wish there were tests for statistical similarity. We test for differences, but what are the chances of getting exactly the same mean out of 5 sample populations with 5 separate administrations over time? And this is on a 5-point scale. And I've rank ordered these by the fall entering data. These are the end of the academic year, and you'll notice that not only are they're consistent over time. The TSI that Richard mentioned does a great deal more thoughtful way of thinking about motivation for ministry. This is just the percent, how important was this as a motivation for you on a Likert scale of entering students. Students are generally pleased with their growth and skills at graduation. All of these years that you counselors have been at work at self-esteem seem to be working. Everybody graduates feeling pretty good about him or herself. Their self-knowledge, their trust in God, this is a 5-point scale. Their respect for, the list goes much further. I just pulled the top, but they feel pretty good. And if that's not a self-esteem indicator, then this is their satisfaction with their progress and development of pastoral skills. We don't know whether these people can interpret Scripture or not, but they're very convinced they can. We don't know whether these people can preach or not, but they're pretty sure they can. So they are graduating with a level of confidence to engage in the skills and the issues that constitute pastoral life and religious leadership. I would notice, I include, the list is longer, I've extracted from the list, but I did go down, and you'll notice that their self-perception of their ability to administer a parish as they're graduating from seminary is one of the lower. So one of the things they're going to be doing if they're appointed to a solo pastor charge, that's the main thing they're going to be doing. I mean, a lot of what they're going to be doing. And so they feel less degree of confidence about that than almost any other area. Finally, we've looked at how theological position changes. We know that students tend to choose seminaries that match their theological conviction. So if they're conservative, they look at conservative seminaries. If they're liberal, they look at liberal seminaries. So there's a huge pre-selection in where they end up. The majority of all ATS students only apply to one seminary. They know where they want to go. They tend to choose it for its theological position and its faculty. And so we ask them, as these are graduates, how has your theological position changed? And last spring, again, about 2,800 from about 120 schools. 15% said they got more conservative. 11% said they got less conservative. We ask it that way because sometimes conservatives can't say, I got more liberal. They have more emotional space to say, I'm less conservative than I used to be. But the dominant category is conservative, so we ask it that way. 34% got more liberal, 2% got less liberal, 40%, the vast majority, the vast plurality, stayed about where they were. So for all of the language of transformation in the mission statements of ATS schools, generally students choose a school that seems to be close to their theological commitment, and then they are reaffirmed in the general parameters of that theological commitment. The group that's most likely to say that they got more liberal are women's MDiv students. They liberalize more in the process of theological education than men do. Well, let's look at vocational inclination of students and persistence in ministry. I need to tell you a little bit about these data. It would be nice to follow people for 10 or 15 years. We've never had the money to do that. So in about 2005, ATS partnered with the Auburn Center for the Theological Education. We took the 1996 data from our entering student questionnaire. We took data from entering a survey that Auburn administered to all entering students that included some of these data, but also questions, but also others. We took the data from ATS of those who graduated in 2005, and then a graduate that was administered in 2005, a survey that was administered in 2005 of graduates from 1995 and 2000. So what we were trying to do is patch together a decade of looking at students when they come to seminary, when they graduate seminary, when they begin ministry, and then persistence in ministry over time. There are lots of data problems, as you would know, with trying to look at the question this way, but it's the only data we had that was accessible apart from a longitudinal study. And here's what found, that the interest in congregational ministry increases over the time students are in seminary. So this is in 1996, the entering students coming in, 51% said they were interested in forms of congregational ministry. And we group everything, all kinds of ministerial work you do in a congregation. Associate pastor, pastor, youth ministry, religious education, Christian social ministries, whatever gets housed in a congregation and called that congregational ministry, as opposed to all of those ministries that are exercised beyond the boundaries of local congregations. At graduation, 65% of students said they wanted to move toward congregational ministry. So seminary recruits both men and women toward congregational ministry during the time they're in school. We also know, or think, at least hypothesize, that more graduates enter congregational ministry than say they plan to enter congregational ministry at graduation. Oh, here's what they said, how many said they were moving toward a parish at the beginning of seminary. Here's how many said they were going to move toward a parish at the end of seminary. And here from the alum survey is how many actually moved into congregational ministry. Our hunch is that congregational employment is the default employment. They may have wanted to go into graduate school. They may have wanted to move into a chaplaincy position. They may have wanted to do a number of other things that depressed the number at this point, but the jobs that were available, or they finally learned that if you want to do some of those other things, you need to spend some time in parish ministry first. So what happens is seminary recruits toward congregational ministry, but then graduation day actually does a significant job of moving more people into congregational ministry than had anticipated that's what they would do. 88% of all MDiv students who graduated in 2000 reported that they were called into some form of either congregational or non-parochial ministry setting. But that means 12% of the people who had just spent 3 years and a lot of their own money never ended up in a congregational setting or any other ministry setting. So the biggest attrition day in theological education is graduation day. Some of that are people who should have decided earlier, or maybe who did, but then wanted to finish the degree. Some of this is a function of persons who were in MDiv program, became married or partnered when they were in seminary, and then only one took a job at the conclusion of seminary. There are lots of different life stories that would inform this, but what we know is if they don't get a job in ministry pretty soon after seminary, they ultimately don't get a job in ministry. I mean, this is, I think we said a year. I think we charted this number, were employed in ministry within a year of graduation. Attrition is greatest at graduation, as I just said, and it looks like it's about 1% a year. This is the number of those 2,000 of 95 graduates who said that they entered ministry upon graduation. 75% were called to a congregation. 74% of this 74% of the total, of which this total was 84%, were still in ministry, and about 64% still in congregation. And then you look at this is over this 5-year period, and this is over a 5-year period, similar. So it looks like you're getting about, from large data perspective, about 1% of decrease in ministry profession per year of service. I imagine you all would say it has to be higher, because some of the other clients you have who are not candidates are the ones trying, either who are in trouble or who are somehow exiting the system. But the numbers who are exiting the system appear to be, at least they tell us survey-wise, less than sometimes we imagine that judicatory leaders or pastoral counselors imagine. The rates of ordination are high, but vary by gender and religious tradition. So you can tell men are more likely across all Christian traditions to get ordained. I don't know what these 13% of women Roman Catholics, that's what you call a data question. It is impossible for Roman Catholics to be, women to be ordained, and there are very strong structures that keep that from happening, so I don't know what that means. My hunch is it means persons who are women who are claiming Roman Catholic identity, but who are ordained and serving in another church body. That would be my guess. Women enter congregational ministry at lower rates than men, and their attrition rates are higher. So this is a comparison by gender. 89% of men, and this is who graduated in 2000, were called into some kind of ministry setting. 87% of women. And then in 2005, when the survey was administered, 84% were still in ministry. There had been 6% attrition of women, 5% of attrition of men. And then this is a look at them sequentially, developmentally through seminary. When they entered seminary, 54% had said, of men had said congregational ministry, compared to 43% of women at the end of seminary, 68% to 61. Actual first call to a congregation, 78 to 70. And then currently in a congregation, notice that the percentage differences increase at every developmental point from graduation to 5 years out. Women are experiencing issues in ministry differently than men, and they are opting out of ministry, particularly congregational ministry, at a higher percentage than men. They constitute about a third of the ATS enrollment. That is stable. That includes enrollment in schools that don't admit women, which is very few of the schools. Only probably 10 or 15 ATS schools actually don't admit women, maybe not even that many. But ministry is a different phenomenon for women than for men, as you know, individual by individual, candidate by candidate. By age, we've looked at those entering congregational ministry, and it's fairly consistent over time for each of these age groups. And you see the differences most dramatically by gender. 51% of MDiv graduates in congregational ministry in graduating 2013. Men said congregational, women 35%. Well, why all of this congregational, non-congregational? Ministry is very widely orbed. Many of you have ministerial credentials in addition to your clinical or counseling credentials. You are exercising your ministry in a non-parochial context. You serve the church, you benefit the church, you contribute to the mission of the church. I have been a pastor only a very few years of my long career. But congregations are the center of U.S. religious life. And much of the parachurch ministry, the extra-church ministry, depends on the health and capacity of congregations to fund, to supply volunteers, to contribute to. The candidacy business in the United Methodist Church would be much reduced if there were no congregations. If all the United Methodist Church did was recognize orders for certain patterns of extension ministry. So we look at this because we think that congregational ministry is sort of a heartbeat indicator for how students and graduates are understanding their work. After graduation, again, women, look at this change. This is the biggest change over time. In 5 years, women have dropped 11 percentage points in terms of graduates who say they want to go into congregational ministry. This is consistent over time. We can go back 15 years and get to above 50% of women who said congregational ministry. So we're clearly moving in the direction of something significant is going on there, in my judgment. And women are opting out of even thinking about congregational ministry or pursuing it. For UMC candidates, I think that you can look at elder and local pastor are 56% of the total percentage of candidates. So just barely over half of the candidates are clear during their candidacy that they're imagining congregational or parish work. The others are undecided, or it's unknown, or the information isn't available. The fastest growing vocational option for seminary students over the past decade is don't know. So we will have the don't know pastors for the nuns in the population. That's what I'm thinking may happen here. There's a lot more vocational ambiguity. So folks come to seminary because they sense a call to God. They sense a call to ministry. When I was at Southern Seminary in Louisville, directing the MDiv, the master's level programs, I did exit interviews with students that were leaving. And I had one student who said, I'm leaving seminary. What I really want is a Baptist monastery, and no such thing exists. This person wanted a vocational religious life that was not occupational. Protestants only offer occupational patterns of religious service. We don't have anything like a monastery where one invests in a community, works at a religious life and calling, but not necessarily working at specific occupational tasks in the church. Well, just briefly, and I know my time is evaporating, but I want to talk with you about what's in the pews when these graduates leave. ATS, and Richard made mention to this, contracted with a research organization for which I worked at the time in the early 70s to do a major survey of the expectations of ministers and priests in the US and Canada. This was a survey that went out to 10,000 people. I don't think it's possible to do that kind of surveying anymore, and was actually completed by 5,000 of them. And I think that response rate is pretty significant. We re-administered basically the same survey 15 years later, and re-administered basically the same survey another 15 years later. So this is a 30-year perspective on expectations of ministers and priests. We have identified, as we grouped together items and then the resulting assessment instrument that was developed that related to these, kind of defining these as the constructs, that ministry often gets perceived, at least it can be ordered statistically. So when people have expectations about ministry, they have expectations about personal characteristics. They also have expectations about patterns of ministry. And these data suggest you can organize these patterns of ministry into 4 broad categories. Ecclesial ministry that focuses on worship and liturgy and the character of the people of God, worshiping God. Conversionist ministry, where much of the church's effort focuses on evangelizing and reaching out in the culture. Another major area, social justice ministry, where the church is engaged trying to change unjust social structures. And then where I think a lot of United Methodist congregations, I think, are one of the highest sponsors of Boy Scout troops in the country. And that's sort of the take care of our community. It's sort of the cultural Protestant presence that remains. So these are not from seminary students. These data are from the people in the pew. And expectations over time are very stable or increasing slightly. There's generally widespread agreements, particularly around personal characteristics. There's the perceptions of ministry style are stable, but the standard deviations are much greater. So if you really love social justice ministry, you probably aren't in love with conversionist ministry. They're not quite inversely related, but they're not highly correlated either. There's a slight negative correlation between the two. So let me go back. Okay. I won't go back. This is answers in 1973, 4, 87, 88, 02, 03. This is 5,000, 2,500, 2,500. Where's our statistical test for similarity? This fidelity to tasks and persons includes items like does not avoid tasks of ministry that he should does not enjoy, finishes what he starts, works at further development of pastoral skills, shows ability of offering opposing view without attacking, demonstrates honest affection for other people. A character of being human. It's not necessarily a theological character. It is one of the highest rated areas across, as is this one on acknowledgement of limitations. This is a 7-point scale. The first 2 points are actually negative, and then it goes neutral, and then it has 4 increasingly important characteristics in the scale. Says willingly, I don't know regarding subjects beyond own knowledge or competence, acknowledges own need for continued growth, shows sufficient awareness of own, that's not one, but own inadequacies. One of my inadequacies is typing for public consumption. To know when help is needed, apologizes when he, she has offended a person. You notice how stable, I mean, we're moving less than 1/10 of a point on a 7-point scale. The ends are so large, these would be statistically significantly different, but I don't know that they're logically significantly different in terms of what a student's going to encounter. So if you have a candidate that says, well, you sense that they don't have any sense of the acknowledgement of their limitations, or that they do the things they want and don't do the things they don't want, and they tell you, I'm going to go in, I'm going to do what I think's right, and I'm not going to worry about the stuff I don't know how to do, and I'm not going to admit that because this is the pastoral office. You can tell them, you can do that, but I bet somebody in the congregation you go to is going to be worried about you, if that's how you construct the performance and character of ministry. This is just an example of some of the areas that we identify as personal characteristics. It continues with things like mutual family commitment, which is really paying attention to family as well as to work. And then their own personal religion, their piety shows sensitivity, leading the Holy Spirit, shows the mission of Christ to be first in their own life, holds that amidst of serious problems, God is at work, acknowledges own sin and confesses this to God. You notice that of all of these I've showed you, this is probably the biggest change over time of any of these data that we've administered over this 30-year period. Yes? It was a stratified sampling structure in which we chose seminaries, and then they chose faculty, administrators, and students for the clergy sample, and then they chose alums, and then alums chose persons in their context of ministry. So, and then the data were weighted so that lay and clergy responses were equally represented. So this is not a kind of person on the street. These are expectations of people in the pew or the colleagues with whom you work, and weighting the two equally. Just a couple. I'm sorry. Yes, I can make a couple of things available, and then you will have all of these slides in your resources for this meeting. Richard mentioned what used to be Readiness for Ministry, now Profiles. What we did is identify these and say these are the criteria that have relevance in ministry. Then we sought, and ATS administers what is now called the Profiles of Ministry, which are assessment instrument that students either entering or graduating take that are related to these constructs. So it's a criterion reference, not a norm referenced instrument. And the criteria to which it's referenced are these expectations. They're negative. And so this is, this keeps the scale, but you're now over into the negative side of the 7-point scale. Generally, people don't like their minister to belittle people in front of others, to be abrupt and impatient with talking with people, to use ministerial role to maintain a sense of superiority. Or self-protecting, tends to be cold and impersonal, frequently shows favoritism, rejects criticism, pouts publicly when things go away. A high degree of agreement that this is not what you want your pastor to do. And for some seminary students, this is news. This comes as a surprise that these are things that you should not do in the congregation. And so in that way, it's sort of a good educational effort. Then just to conclude, looking at a couple of these expectations areas, remember I showed you personal characteristics and then patterns of ministry. Here are a couple of scales on the ecclesial ministry, relating faith. And these titles are and are not always very helpful. You know that the data are located as related in the items that were in the expectation survey. But again, look across time. Over 30 years with 3 completely different samples chosen in the same way, and you come up with means that haven't varied more than 1/10 of a point. Guides people by relating scripture to the human condition, uses biblical insights to guide members in making ethical or moral decisions. Again, if anything, this one is increasing. I think as the society secularizes, they want to know that a minister is somehow a person of God, that somehow there is a deep thread of religious reality. And it's not that they want the minister to be religious on their behalf, it's that there are lots of voices out there, and they need to be able to identify what is the authentic religious voice. And they do that by, at least that's my hunch, and the only one of these means that has shifted very meaningfully over time would be these expectations of kind of religious presence. Here's the conversionist ministry. You'll notice the means are lower significantly. Social justice ministry, the means are a little higher, but again, they're so consistent across time. And from community and congregational pastoral service to all, building congregational community. Again, a certain significance, building congregational communities has moved down a little bit. I think that the character of church attending is shifting, and that might be present. More and more people are in larger membership congregations. That might be contributing to this decline, I don't know. Well, here's the story. Seminary graduates are entering a changing religious world that will continue changing during their ministry, and there likely will be less religious adherence by conclusion of their ministries. That's that first cultural set. Secondly, the generation of ministers will be more racial ethnic, more evangelical, both older and younger, generally pleased with what they skills and perceptions they're taking with them to ministry, and in significant amounts of debt. The generation will be less oriented to patterns of congregational ministry, reflect reasonable persistence in ministry, not necessarily congregational, and many complete seminary undecided about their vocational direction of ministry. And finally, they will enter a world of expectations that is very stable over time and where there is change, expectations seem to have increased, primarily in the area of kind of religious identity and capacity to communicate oneself. Not everything that can be counted counts. But I think the data tell a story. And that story has a long arc from the world in which these students coming into seminary are kind of moving against the cultural trend to the kind of struggle they will have in ministry as cultural trends continue, to what they brought with them in seminary and what they took with them in the world that they experience beyond. So thank you.
I was very interested in your data of people over 50 entering ministry, and I think you attributed it to people who had completed a career, and I wondered about the effect of empty nesters, people who had finished raising their kids and looking to set up the second half of a career life.
You all have a better answer for that than I do. I'm speculating. I think it's, my one basis in reality, in our conference, the bishop identifies about 8 or 10 provisional elder members that are perceived to maybe have capacity to contribute uniquely, and they actually meet for a year with my former pastor, who's now retired, who visits them in their church, and they meet monthly and do case study kind of conversations. And once a year for the last 5 years, they've met with me. So I've met this group, and there would be several in that group who are empty nesters, who are very able, who are going to make a significant contribution for the years of career that they have in front of them. But they waited until the kids were closer to out of college and they could take a hit on income that had not been possible for them to take. So they reflect the kind of movement from money to meaning in the kind of the broader career script in the culture. And some of them have done that. Some of them really have finished a military career or a school teaching career or a civil service career, one of the kinds that are sort of 25 and out, and they're 55 and they're, I want to work, I want to be doing something meaningful till I'm 70. And they choose to think about ministry, and they have been active participants in congregational life. They didn't just become Christians 2 years ago and then show up at seminary. They're pretty long-term Christian stories, that at least the ones I've talked to in that age group. Yeah.
What about the prophetic voice of our younger clergy as they go into these congregations that have pretty standard expectations that over the length of time of ministry, and at least in my experience, I'm finding younger clergy having a difficult time living into that prophetic voice and then being able to sustain themselves in ministry. Any clues on that for the future?
I'm afraid the question's above my pay grade, but I'm going to try it and answer. Prophetic witness has always been complex in the context of the priestly reality of taking care of the people at church. It's not a new problem. What has changed in some ways is that the social structures that provided support for pastors to take prophetic stands have weakened. So the safety net has weakened. One of the great stories of the civil rights movement in North Carolina was written up as "Blood Done Sign My Name." And there's this wonderful passage in there where the United Methodist pastor is hosting a community service in honor of Martin Luther King at a time where that part of North Carolina is very divided racially. And this is a pastor who made significant prophetic witness on racial justice issues. And when people in the congregation took him to task for that, he pulled down the book of discipline. And he opened to the passage that says the pastor has the authority to guide the worship and public meeting life of the congregation. I think if the same pastor would do that now, a lot of United Methodist lay people would say, so what? What does that book have to do with us here at Mount Pisgah, where we do it this way? So what happens is this erosion of kind of the safety net that made a prophetic witness in certain circumstances, which was a gift of United Methodism, both with its social consciousness, but also with a structure that kind of provided a little pastoral protection. That has weakened. The other thing that's weakened is that prophetic witness in the Hebrew Scriptures is sort of a witness to the broader cultural reality, not just the religious reality. And mainline Protestants have lost so much cultural presence that the broader cultural reality isn't even listening anymore. And so you can be prophetic, but it's sort of like being out there on the street corner with one of those signs that the fundamentalists used to have, where everybody just keeps walking by. That a part of the prophetic witness that was dominant in 20th century mainline Protestantism was, in fact, that it had a certain social presence. And Niebuhr makes the cover of Time magazine. And there was a perception that this ought to be listened to. And so, the gospel hasn't changed. The need for prophetic witness hasn't changed. But the social world capacity to listen to the witness of the church and has changed, and the safety net that sort of encouraged people who make a living being prophets to go on with that has weakened. Those are two speculative responses.
Thank you.
One more. You get the last question.
Okay, thank you. I have a question about the statistics I saw with the increase in seminary participation around the year of 2002, while a simultaneous decline in the overall trust in churches at that time. And I'm wondering if that may have happened because of the 9/11 attacks.
I think that it's more related, if you look at that Gallup data that I showed earlier about if you look at the precipitous declines, you can correlate them pretty readily to significant public events. So in the 90s, you've got Jimmy Swaggart and Jimmy Baker. And in the early 2000s, you have the Roman Catholic priest child abuse crisis. And so it's almost, I think it's more a response not to 9/11, but to the Catholic, to a kind of destabilizing. You can't trust the church anymore because of what its leaders are doing. And those leaders, in the case of the 90s, were televangelists that fell pretty dramatically. And then the exposure of the extent of Roman Catholic priest abuse of minors that was right at that time. And it was so much the dominant news story that I think it affected the way people were responding to Gallup.